Hi, hello, Lisa and I welcome you to this video, which is going to be my review of the I Need a Nude palette from Natasha Denona, the newest MIDI palette addition to her eyeshadow palette lineup. Now, I'm going to quickly break down the video for you so you know what's happening. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to do some swatches, and I'm going to do them slightly differently because I've had the palette for a little bit now and I actually want to talk a little bit more in depth about the formulas that are present in this palette. And I'm going to do just a few extra comparison swatches to add to the video that I already posted last week, where I very thoroughly compared the I Need a Nude palette to my Pat McGrath Labs collection. A couple of you had requests for some extra swatches, so I'm going to add those to the video as well. Then we're going to do 3 looks using the palette, and finally I'm going to come back and tell you my final review of this palette. Personally, I'm always very attracted to Natasha's monochromatic palettes, and I never have the urge to buy her colorful eyeshadow palettes, which is why 100% of my eyeshadow palette collection from Natasha Denona is her monochromatic palettes. So I'm also going to make a few references to the Face and Eye Glam palettes, to the Gold palette, and particularly to the Glam palette, because obviously when you look at these two palettes, and especially the insides of these two palettes, they sort of run along the same theme of like neutral shades, but like this is a little bit more meant to be like cooler toned nudes, whereas Glam is, as suggested by the name, supposed to be a little bit more like amped up and glam. But what I want to do now is I'm going to do the swatches a little bit different than I usually do. Usually I'll just like sort of like start from the beginning of the palette and go row by row, but today I'm going to do it differently. I'm going to group the eyeshadows sort of in like the different textures that I feel like are present in here. So the first obvious texture that we're going to talk about are the matte eyeshadows in here. None of these are her cream to matte formula, they're all her like regular powder formula. I do feel like they're a little bit more harder pressed than compared to what's, for example, in the Glam palette. But that's not to say they don't perform well. Just to illustrate what I mean, this is my Glam palette, and I have swatched it, I've used it quite a bit. I don't know whether you can see the eyeshadows, just they feel very soft to me, whereas the eyeshadows in the I Need a Nude palette feel a little bit more harder pressed, and because of that a little bit more prone to hard pan. I don't know whether you can see that, and obviously if I put my fingers in there, which may be slightly oily, slightly wet or whatever, that will cause a little bit more of hard pan. But I feel like with this specific palette, the hard pan is a little bit more pronounced than what I'm usually used to with her matte eyeshadows. There are a total of 7 matte eyeshadows in here, so I'm just going to quickly swatch them for you. So the shades are Stone, Vague, Silhouette, Fair, Wit, Tender, and Mash. And I think the first thing you will notice is that there isn't really a lot of variation in the depths of the matte eyeshadows in here, and I think that's also my biggest criticism of this palette, that I feel like there's a lot of like first of all redundancy and shades that are, to me personally, like totally unnecessary. Like there is, to me, no need to have both the shades Stone and Mesh in here, because they are so incredibly similar. On the eye they look slightly different because Stone is a little bit more gray toned, whereas Mesh has a little bit more brown tones to it. But honestly, I would have much rather had another like mid-tone brown shade, just in case I want to vary a little bit more like the depth of the look. Because now you have this deeper shade over here, the shade Silhouette, which is quite a like dark brown, at least on my skin tone. This shade here is somewhat of a mid-tone shade, the shade Tender. You can get this shade to give you a little bit more depth if you've used any of these two shades, but honestly, compared to previous palettes from her, where we've just gotten a little bit more variety in the depths and the tones of the matte shades, I think the I Need a Nude palette is like slightly lacking in that aspect. In addition, the shade Fair to me is sort of like an unnecessary shade. It's the kind of shade that will serve as a brow bone highlight on me, It will probably be a blending out shade for someone with a very fair skin tone, and it will probably be totally useless for someone who has deeper skin tone. And that's the other thing, that if you have a very like deep skin tone, there isn't really that much for you to work with if you want to deepen out your look, because I think these are probably barely going to show up and they're going to look the same. This one's not going to show up at all. This one may be your transition shade and this one may be your deepening out shade. I think that it is very nice to have the sort of like the variety of these two shades here. So these are the shades Vague and Wit. I specifically like the shade Vague in here because it has these like slightly rosy terracotta tones to it, and it's not very cool tone, but it's also not very warm toned. And because this palette is supposed to be cooler leaning, I think it fits very nicely with the color story. The shade Wit, I don't really mind, but I could take it or leave it. I don't really care so much for it. Now another thing that I think is worth mentioning is that all of these shades are, and like the whole palette, resides in a very specific undertone. It is a cooler, pink, leaning, neutral palette. And just to illustrate the undertones that reside in this palette, I want to swatch a couple of the matte eyeshadows that are present in the Glam palette for you to be able to truly appreciate the specific undertones that are present in I Need a Nude. So I'm going to swatch these three neutral shades here, like the more mid-tone shades from the Glam palette, so you can see the difference. So this is Glam. And do you already see how much more like variety there is in the undertones here as compared to here? Just looking at these three shades, you have this more like gray toned neutral shade, then you have this one which almost leans a little bit more warm toned, and this one which is truly a little bit more of like a neutral to slightly warm undertone. And what I think stands out even more, especially when you take this shade and you compare it to the two lighter matte shades from the I Need a Nude palette, you see those much stronger pink undertones that these two shades have compared to this, which almost looks to be neutral by comparison. In terms of extra comparisons, there was only one request for a matte shade that you wanted me to compare to, and that was the peachy shade in the Divine Rose 2 palette compared to the peachy shades in the I Need a Nude. So I swatched the shade from Pat right here, and these are the two peachy nudes, well, peachy nudes. This one's more of a terracotta. This is really the only peachy nude in the I Need a Nude palette, and you can see this is much more vibrant. So the next type of formula that is present in this palette is present in this shade over here, the shade Travertine, I want to say. Then we have also the shades Whisper, and this one over here, the shade Sheen. All of these three shades I would qualify to be that like more satin type formula. They're not high shine metallics, they're not flaky, they're not very dense, they're just a little bit more subtle. They have a nice sheen, but they're a little bit more subtle. So this is the shade Whisper, the shade Travertine, and the shade Sheen. As you can see, they're pretty, they have a little bit of a sheen to them, but they're not high shine, they're not high flaky, dense kind of metallic eyeshadows. And certainly not a kind of formula, for instance, that is at all present in the Glam palette. In the Glam palette you have these like really high shine, dense metallic eyeshadows, and I just want to swatch for you so that you can see a little bit. Do you see how much more impactful and dense these look compared to these satin shades here? Just let me give those a swatch so that you can see how much more like body there is to the shades in the Glam palette compared to these three from the I Need a Nude. Okay, the next type of formula that is present in here is present in the shades Delilah and the shade Mia. And I think it's been a while since we've seen this formula, but I don't think it's the first time that we're seeing it, because as soon as I put my finger into these eyeshadows, I was like, this reminds me of something, and it reminds me of something from Natasha Denona. And after thinking for quite a while, I finally figured it out. It reminds me of some of the formulas that are present in the Gold palette. So let me swatch the shades Delilah and Mia for you so that you can have a little bit of an idea of what they're like. So these shades are again not flaky, dense, intense metallic eyeshadows. They have more like that satin base, and they have a sheen to them, like there is sparkle to them, but they are very smooth in terms of their texture, and the sparkle is very fine. Delilah actually has really beautiful sort of like cooler toned bluish purplish silver sparkle to it, and the shade Mia has that cooler toned pink base to it with what appears to be purple sparkles. And I just want to shine a little bit of artificial light on these two shades so that you can see the sparkle a little bit. And again, this is not a formula that is, for example, present in her Glam palette or in her Bronze palette. And the only palette that I personally have in my collection that somewhat has a similar texture to it is this gold shade over here from the Gold palette. It has that same like wet sheen kind of effect to it. So yeah, I don't know if you guys have the Gold palette. What do you think about the formula of these three eyeshadows? Do you think it is similar to each other? Because honestly, that's the only thing that I could think of that these two, the texture of these two eyeshadows reminds me of. The next type of formula that I can detect in here is present in the shades Ella, so this more neutrally brown here, and the shade Filigree, which is a deeper, like more cool tone brown with definitely a lot of like silver sparkle to it. These are a little bit more of that dense metallic formula. This is the shade Ella, and this is the shade, oh no, sorry, this is Ella and this is Filigree. I am really fond of the shade Filigree because I think it is such an interesting tone. I think both of these are in fact quite neutral in their tones. I wouldn't necessarily say that either of these is cool toned brown, neither are they warm toned. I think maybe the shade Ella has slightly pinker and maybe slightly warmer tones to it compared to the shade Filigree, just because Filigree has that like silver sparkle to it. But to me these are like intense metallic eyeshadows. And the final formula that is present in the Glam palette is only present in one eyeshadow in my opinion, and that is this one over here. That is the eye-catching shade, the shade Muse. Now Muse is very flaky, very dense and very glittery, and I immediately knew what the texture of this eyeshadow reminds me of. It is very sparkly. Let me quickly shine an artificial light on Ella, Filigree and Muse so that you can see that all the three shades are actually have beautiful also reflex to them. To me, the shade Muse, so this flaky sparkly shade over here, is basically the same kind of texture that, again, going back to the Glam palette, would be comparable to this flaky duochromy shade over here. It's again that like very dense, very again flaky type of formula that delivers a lot of impact and a lot of shine. As you can see, to me these are the most similar ones to each other. Now, and with that we have basically completed all the textures that are present in this palette. And last but not least, I also wanted to give you like a full-on swatch of the whole palette of all the eyeshadows next to each other. So starting from the shade Stone and ending with the shade Mia over here. You may have noticed that conspicuously I never mentioned that any of the eyeshadows in the I Need a Nude palette are similar to my favorite formula from Natasha Denona, especially from her metallics, which is present in her Face and Eye Glam palettes. And I'll be honest with you, I don't think that this formula is present in this new palette. Even if you just look visually, I don't know whether it is obvious to you as it is to me, that to me the formula of these two eyeshadows in here is just not the same as any of the formulas that are present in the I Need a Nude palette, which I'll be honest with you, I was a little bit disappointed by, because I figured if we're going to be offered like a whole bunch of different formulas, for sure we're going to see the one from the Glam Face and Eye palette being present again, but it is just not the case. In terms of extra swatches, one of you asked me to compare the shade Enigma, so this one over here, to some of the eyeshadows that are present in here. I can say that I think Enigma looks like anything that's present in here. I swatched Travertine and Delilah here for you because I figured they would be the most similar ones, but honestly I think Enigma is a completely different undertone of eyeshadow. This is much more like gray based compared to these two, which are more like brown beige. And Alice asked me to also compare to the cooler toned neutral that is present in the Bronze Seduction palette, but again I think that is a completely different eyeshadow, because at least from memory the one from Bronze Seduction has almost like greenish undertones to it. So we're talking about this shade here and the shades in the I Need a Nude. So I'm going to quickly swatch the eyeshadow from Pat. So here is the shade from Bronze Seduction, and let me see if I see something similar. Maybe the shade Ella over here would be a somewhat similar one. Let's watch them next to each other. No, you can see those like slightly almost like greenish undertones of this compared to this, which is much more brown and neutral in tone. By the way, it was probably clear from the beginning, but I'm actually not wearing the I Need a Nude palette at all for the intro and the outro portion of this video, because I've been filming with it for this past week and I was really craving some warmer tones. But I will leave you now with the 3 looks that I created with the palette, and then I'm going to come back to give you my final thoughts on the palette. Alright, let's do look number 1 with the I Need a Nude palette. I was initially thinking of just doing the eye looks together with you, but then I figured, personally, I'm going to take the Inglot eyeshadow primer. I really like it when I see what people use in terms of their base makeup, and especially, you know, the bronzer, blush, highlighter, that kind of thing. So I figured I'm just going to give this a try. And if you really end up not enjoying this, do let me know, and next time I do a video like this where I demo several looks with a palette, I will forego all of the base makeup and I will just show the eye looks. But for the time being, we're doing it this way. I'm going to take the Estee Lauder Double Wear Foundation, the original, in the shade 3N1, because this is the only foundation that somewhat matches me when I'm in my summer shade. It's not even a foundation that I bought myself. It's a foundation that one of my friends at work bought, and it was a bit too dark for her, and then she gave it to me because she knows how much I love the original Double Wear foundation, and I've been using it as like my summer foundation for the past couple of years, and every time I start using it I'm reminded how much like my skin loves the original Double Wear formula. I actually have a brand new Double Wear in my original shade, the 2N1, and I'm waiting impatiently to open that, but I've promised myself that I need to get through to some of the other foundations that I currently have open, such as, for example, the Dior Backstage. I think I'm really close with the Dior Backstage. I will finish it before the end of the year, and then I will finally be allowed to open my beloved Estee Lauder Double Wear. I know people always say it is a very high coverage foundation, but honestly I do think you can sheer it out. Like, for example, here I have a little pimple. You can still see the pimple, so you can apply this foundation with rather a sheer layer if you really wanted that. I'm taking the Lancome Teint Idol Concealer in the shade... oh lordy, what shade is this? In the shade 01. I've been using this concealer for the past 2 weeks because I took it on holiday with me, and I was reminded once again what a glorious concealer this is. It's a bummer that it doesn't match me as a shade, because other than that I actually think this is a glorious concealer. It looks super beautiful underneath the eyes, it doesn't dry them out, and it sort of smoothens the texture underneath my eyes. It's not quite as creamy as the Dior Skin Correct, my current favorite concealer. It's more like a demi-matte finish, but it does look so flattering underneath my eyes, and that says something. When I say that something looks flattering underneath my eyes, that says a lot about a concealer. I'm going to set with the Dior Backstage powder. This is in the shade 2N. Just to very quickly apply a layer of powder over top of the foundation so that it lasts even better than it would otherwise. I'm going to speed through doing my brows with the Too Faced Laminating Brow Wax. For bronzer, I'm going to take the Dior Natural Bronze in the shade Deep. I have a somewhat inexplicable, unhealthy obsession with this specific bronzer, and I can't really tell you why. It is a very deep shade, but because the formula is so malleable, you can really sheer it out and you can get away with it even if you're as fair as I am. And now that I've got a bit of a tan, I'm really making the best out of it. and I've really been enjoying it. I don't know if it's the formula or the color that I'm like so unhealthily obsessed with, but I really enjoy this bronzer and I use it all the freaking time. For blush, I actually wanted to show you something new. I'm not going to talk about it in detail too much here, but this is the Armani Luminous Silk blush in the shade 10, which I picked up on recommendation of Martina. So this is sort of like a, I think it's described as a peachy beige. And I am utterly curious whether this shade is going to even show up on me now, because it required a bit of building before I went on holiday. So I'm curious whether it will show up now. Ah, it's showing up. It's showing up. Just fine. It is a really beautiful shade. I like how like sort of neutral it is, but with like those slightly peachy pink tones to it. It's the kind of blush that you can really use with pretty much any look. And I like that it's a very like buildable formula. It sort of blurs the skin a little bit. It's very lightweight. For highlighter, I'm going to take Pat McGrath Labs Venusian Nude. I've really been missing my Venusian Nude highlighter. And it is very nice, and it works also when I'm a bit tan, which is lovely to see. Alright, taking the I Need a Nude palette from Natasha, and the first shade I'm going to take is this one here. This is the shade Vague, which is the somewhat deeper, like rosy, terracotta kind of color. And I'm actually very curious how this is going to apply on the eye, because when I first swatched it and I saw it, I thought this is going to be quite a cool toned pink shade. But I feel like it's going to actually pull warm and sort of peachy terracotta. Not as cool as I was expecting, actually. I quite like this. I'm thinking now, does it remind me a little bit of the matte, the terracotta matte that's in Moonlit Seduction? Mental note to self, swatch that next to the matte in Moonlit Seduction. I have no issues picking up the powder here. The powders are very like lightweight, very blendable. No issues with anything so far. Now I don't know that this shade is going to survive in the palette for too long, but I'm going to put the like beige creamy shade as my brow bone highlight, because I'm guessing that's the intention on someone with the depth of my skin tone. I'm guessing on really pale people this is going to be a transition shade. And the reason I'm saying it's not going to survive in here for too long is because I am plotting on making my perfect, like, I need a glam palette by combining favorite shades from both palettes into one. Now, an obvious little limitation of this palette, this is the only like dark shade that you are given. So whatever you do, if you want to deepen out your outer corner, and this is what I want to do, you have to use the shade Silhouette. It's not necessarily a bad thing, especially if you're far more invested in the metallic shades. And I do think that it's really nice that she has included a lot of metallic shades and a lot of different textures of metallic shades in here. But if you wanted to take your outer corner in a slightly different direction tonally, then that wouldn't be possible, because the only really dark shade in here is Silhouette. I'm applying it a little bit as an outer corner slash liner kind of situation, just to give a little bit of definition here in the base of my lashes. I'm going to take a little bit of NYX glitter glue. Mine is in this little pot because my packaging broke and I repotted it. And I'm going to apply a little bit here on my lid where I want the metallic shades to be. I actually have the feeling that this has finally started to really dry out, and I might have to pull out for my new one. Honestly, it took a while for this to happen. I was really scared that it would happen like a week after I repotted it, but it's been months. I've almost like used it up, like not completely, but like 70% used up. Alright, now I am going to take a little flat shader brush to start with, and if necessary use my fingers. And I'm going to take this shade here, the shade Ella, which is really beautiful, sort of like neutral brown with sparkles to it, and I'm going to apply that in the outer portion of the lid. This has a really beautiful reflective effect to it. and it's a really, really nice tone of brown. I really like how neutral it is. It's more of a mid-tone brown, it's not a super deep brown. I think if you wanted to go deeper, you would have to go with this one here, the shade Filigree. But I've used the shade Filigree already. Well, we will use it in another look because I've already used it for the first look that I did with the palette, and I'm trying to use shades that I haven't really used yet. Then I'm going to go back and apply this shade here, the shade Sheen, on the inner portion and inner corner of the eye, because also it is a little bit like rosier and not too cool toned. Today I'm going for a more like neutral slash warm, to show you that the palette does offer that possibility should you want to do something different than just the really cool toned, gray toned shadows. There is the option to go in a somewhat warmer direction for sure. And you can 100% stop here, but I can hardly stay away from the shade Muse here, which is like the really flaky one. And I'm going to apply a little bit of that, more like towards the center of the lid, for some extra light there. To me, you can use this shade as a standalone, or you can use it as a topper. But if you are going to use it as a topper, you need to be very careful, because the first time I used it, on one of my eyes I applied just a little bit too much, and it did start to look a little bit textured. So you do have to be careful with this shade. But it does give a really beautiful, you know, glimmer effect on the lids. Taking that slightly in, just so it blends in nicely with that shade we put on the inner part of the lid. On my lower lashes, I'm basically going to repeat what I did before. I'm going to take a little bit of this shade and a tiny bit of this one. Taking a little bit of the pinky terracotta first to run here. And then using the flat shader brush, which has a somewhat more precise point to it, I'm going to take a little bit of the brown, like the deep, deep brown silhouette, and apply that at the very outer corner of the eye. And here is with an artificial light shown on the sparkles, so that you can see how beautifully reflected this look has turned out. I'm standing in like non-direct sunlight, so I don't think you can really appreciate them without the artificial lighting. But yeah, in low lighting, artificial lighting, this is what the look would look like. It doesn't 100% match my shirt and my earrings, but I did go for a Velvet Bloom from Lisa Eldridge, because I think other than that it really complements the look really nicely. I really like this look. I think it turned out tonally quite different from the very first look that I did, because like I said, I already wore the palette once after I bought it, and the look that I did then was really cool tone, like almost like silvery cool tone taupe. And this turned out completely different in terms of its tonality, which really pleasantly surprises me. So, look number 2 today. I've already basically done all of the base prep makeup, because it's essentially the same that I did for the first look, it being that I really only have one product per category when I'm a little bit more tan. So, you know, foundation, powder, that kind of thing, it's all the same. So now we're going to do the rest of the steps together. I'm going to start with my bronzer, and I'm going to go in with Nude Honey from Pat McGrath, because I want to, again, apply something that is a little bit more neutral to cool. And I'm actually really curious if this bronzer is actually going to show up on me if I've got a tan. And from what I can tell, it's actually showing up just fine. If I sound a little bit congested, that's because I was super congested. We've actually had a 2-day delay in making this video, or I've had a 2-day delay making this video, because all of a sudden on Monday evening, out of the blue, I started sneezing and my nose started running, and Tuesday and Wednesday I was actually rather sick. So today is the first day that I'm feeling a little bit more human and I feel like putting on makeup. And I'm actually really excited to play with my makeup, because I've received some beautiful new products that I cannot wait to try. But we first need to get the I Need a Nude video out of the way. For blush, I'm going to take, again, Pat McGrath Labs, but this is the shade Nude Venus 2, which is one of my favorites to use when I don't really know if the look is going to turn out warm or cool, and I want to go with a blush that kind of sits between both categories, because this has the pink, like the peachy pink base to it, but it also has a bit of like a cooler toned purpley shift to it. Don't know whether that's coming across on camera. Basically, it's a slightly more amped up version of the blush that I used for look 1, the Armani one. The Armani one is like a more desaturated peach beige compared to the original Nude Venus, but it again has those like slightly pinky tones to it, and I feel like Nude Venus 2 is a slightly more amped up version of that Armani blush. For highlighter, I'm going to take the beautiful Nabla Skin Glazing in the shade Privilege. Still one of my absolute favorite formulas. I feel like Nabla is really like missing on something by not expanding this range, or honestly, they've missed the boat by now. They should have really expanded on the range of both this, the blushes and the bronzers, because the formula is impeccable. Today I want to go for a somewhat like more lighter look, just in case I have like a coughing spree and my makeup starts running all over my face. So I'm going to actually start off with one of these two like cooler toned shades. I like the shade Mesh a little bit better than I like the shade Stone. So I'm going to start off with that shade. So when I first got the palette and I swatched the shades Mesh and Stone, so the two cooler toned nude browns, I actually thought that they would be the same on the eye. So then, just for, you know, experimental purposes, the first time I applied my makeup, I did Mesh on one eye and Stone on the other eye. And while they are wildly similar, there is a small difference in their undertone. Obviously there is a difference in their undertone, otherwise Natasha wouldn't have put it in there. But Mesh is a little bit more brown. It's like a pinky, mauve toned brown, whereas Stone really has more pronounced gray undertones to it, which is why I like the shade Mesh a little bit more. It has my preference a slight bit more. I think it's a really nice like contouring shade. Again, I'm going to take the shade Fair over here to do my brow bone, and while I'm at it, I'm going to show you, I'm going to use this shade here, the shade, what is that called? Tender. So the mid-tone, cool tone brown shade, in order to deepen out the outer corner, because like I said, we're going for a somewhat more subdued look today, especially nothing too crazy in terms of deeper eyeshadows, because those are going to smudge like mofos if I have a coughing spree. I'm taking a more precise brush and going into the shade Tender, and I'm just going to fluff that right here in the outer corner of the eye. Nothing too crazy, and in fact I'm actually also going to take the shade Tender here on my lower lashes while I'm at it, to contour the lower lash line too, and be done with it. I wasn't quite sure that this shade would be significantly deeper to provide the definition that I'm looking for, but at least on my skin tone it does give some extra definition. Now I'm going to take my NYX glitter glue. I'm still squeezing the last bits of life out of my depotted NYX glitter glue and applying that all over the lid, because I want to apply one of the sparkly shades now. And I think the shades that I'm going to go for on my lids would be this one over here, the shade Whisper. That's going to go in the like inner portion of the eye and inner corner, and then I'm going to apply this shade here, the shade Delilah, over the rest of the lid. Now the shade Delilah is one of the newer type formulas that is present in this palette, because it is a very like sparkly eyeshadow, but it doesn't feel like it's thick dense metallic. It has like a very lightweight texture to it, and it has a very beautiful like glass skin effect, if you will, because of that sparkle. So I'm going to apply that shade basically on most of my lid, but leave the inner portion free for the shade, the other shade that I said, yeah, Whisper. This is a very pretty shade, beautiful, like perfect for like a neutral to somewhat like more cool toned look, but also light enough to go on the lid so that it doesn't look overly smoky. I don't think this shade looks too smoky. Now I'm going to apply the shade Whisper on the inner portion of the eyelid as well as the inner corners. This shade is also interesting because it is quite a subtle shade in terms of its finish. It's not a high shine metallic, it's definitely more of like a satin, but it does have a really beautiful sheen to it. And here is with a little bit of artificial light, so you see how beautiful the shade Delilah is. It really creates that like wet look effect. I'm wearing a Velvet Rain from Lisa Eldridge because I think it's one of those lipsticks that again plays just really well with both warm and cooler tones, and I didn't really feel like wearing a red today just in case things get a little bit smudgy if I have to blow my nose and stuff. So as you can tell, I do take these kind of things into consideration. I hope that you enjoyed this look. We're going to see each other for one more look, which is going to feature the more like warmer pinky shades. Alright, look number 3, you know the drill. I've already done my base makeup in the exact same way that I did for look number 1, and I'm going to now do my bronzer, blush and highlighter with you. I'm going to take the Victoria Beckham bronzing brick in the shade 02 in order to hopefully contour slash bronze. This is a more neutral toned bronzer. As you can see, I've been pulling for my somewhat more neutral toned bronzers instead of my warmer toned ones because, you know, I'm trying to keep in with the tones of the I Need a Nude palette, and they are rather cool toned. Also, if you think, don't you look different today? It is because I got a haircut yesterday, a much needed haircut. I was beginning to look absolutely ridiculous. I have my hair rather short the past year or two, and the thing with short hair, especially with a bob haircut like this, is that it starts to look messy much more quickly than if you have longer hair, because especially here towards the back where it's usually quite nicely shaved off, I start getting like this little like curl on the back, and then I know it is imperative that I see my hairdresser ASAP. So yes, if my hair looks wildly different compared to the other two looks, it's because I did get a haircut in between. It is also the 1st of September today, and I think I'm going to pull out for my little cartwheel here from Pat McGrath Labs. This is the Blushing Delights palette, and I'm going to apply a little bit of this plum shade and maybe a little bit of this pink towards the apples of my cheeks. So I'll try to concentrate the plum here more onto like the higher points, because it is a very pretty shade, but it could be a little bit more intense on me. And then I'm going to apply the pinky one more here towards the apples of the cheeks for some extra liveliness. For highlighter, I'm going to take Golden Nectar from Pat McGrath Labs, and just to quickly add a little bit of light here on the cheekbones, and by a little bit I mean a crap ton, because I always forget how much punch this highlighter packs on. So there's going to be a little bit of blending that I have to do on this side, because I kind of overdid the amount that I put down. Oh boy. Okay, so at this point the only eyeshadows in this palette that I truly haven't used yet are this like warmer tone, sort of like peachy nude shade, and this topper here. But I think I'm going to do something slightly different today. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take the shade Silhouette and sort of apply it as like my liner here in the base of my lashes. And sometimes I will do that when I'm going for like a somewhat more different structure of the look. So you will have seen this look from me before. And I am also plotting on actually putting a little bit of a green liner on my lower lashes, because I'm going to be wearing my pretty green vest today. So this one. And there's no way that I'm going to wear this vest and not add some sort of a green element to it. And wouldn't it have been really sweet if Natasha had added like a pop of forest green and something with like forest green sparkles in this palette? We'll talk about it again during the review, but I feel like after gold, she hasn't really done a monochromatic palette that is just slightly more versatile than what it says it would offer. Like, I love bronze, I love glam, I think they're gorgeous palettes, but like gold had it kind of like all. It had the golds, but it also had like the browns, and it also had that beautiful pop of teal in there, whereas the subsequent iterations of her monochromatic palettes have been, you know, just that one specific undertone or shade that she has chosen and centered around it without any like extra pops. And I really feel like most of her monochromatic palettes would only benefit from the addition of one or two of these like poppy shades. And this specific color story, like this cool toned nude brown color story, would have been absolutely fabulous with like a pop of forest green in there, don't you think? Anyway, what I think and what Natasha thinks are two very different things. But now I'm going to go back into this palette and I'm going to take the shade of it over here, and I'm going to actually apply that all over my lids, like a little bit as a wash of color, and blend it into the crease, just like this. And then I'm going to blend it out. This shade is definitely probably like the most warm toned shade in this palette. That is the shade Wit. I keep calling it Wit, which you will excuse me for, because in Dutch wit is white and it's pronounced wit, and it's just so in my system to say wit that I didn't catch myself that I was saying it this way until I heard someone talk about this palette and saying wit, and I was like, oh crap. Of course it's wit and not wit. I'm going to put down just the absolute tiniest bit of glitter glue, and I will try to be careful and just sort of dab it over top of that mat, because otherwise I will lift the mat. So you literally just take the absolute tiniest amount and you dab it on, just so you don't completely lift what's underneath, because the idea is that the shimmery shade, that Mia shade, can have something to stick to and look really wet and metallic, but without completely erasing the color that we put underneath as a bit of a base. So I'm actually going to just use that fluffy brush on which I had the shade Wit and go into the shade Mia now, and just take a generous amount of that and apply that all over the eyelid and over the shade Wit, because I think that would create a really beautiful effect. And this shade is a bit more cool toned actually applied on the eye. I actually want to see what this will do if I apply it on my finger on my other eye, because I think I will prefer the finish. Yeah, I prefer the finish of this shade applied with my finger. It just looks a little bit smoother. So I think I'm going to do that also on my other eye, just go over everything one more time. In my inner corner I'm going to take the shade Sheen, this one over here, which is I think going to be a beautiful like inner corner highlighty shade that sort of fits the rest of the vibe of this look. Now if you want to keep the look very neutral, you can just apply whatever you want on your lower lashes, a bit of the deep brown and the shade Wit again, just to keep it consistent. But like I said, I want to pop a little bit of a green because I have a pretty neutral outfit for the rest. I have black trousers and this like black and white t-shirt, and I am going to put the green vest later on. So I'm going to take this MAC pencil and apply that in my waterline here as a base. Slightly run it also on the lower lashes, and then I'm going to set it with an eyeshadow in a similar color. And the eyeshadow is going to be from this little Inglot palette that I have here, and this beautiful green, which I think would fit perfectly with this look, and I haven't used this shade in such a long time. I haven't used my Inglot eyeshadows in like many years, which is a shame because when I first discovered Inglot, because Inglot has been around for far longer than I've been into makeup, I adored using my Inglot eyeshadows. I took them everywhere despite how heavy the palettes are. I'm just going to lightly blend out. Oh, this looks... I really like pink and green together. I think it's a contrasting color combination that I use a lot. Now I want to blend this green out a bit with a clean brush, so I'm just going to take a small brush and do a tiny bit of blending here. And sometimes what I will do after I have set with the eyeshadow is go back with the liner and give it one last stroke here in the waterline just to completely cement it, because obligatory a sparkle moment, just so you can see that the beautiful topper shade, the shade Mia, is actually very, very sparkly. It is really pretty. I'm going to be like in low lighting this whole day because we're going to like a symposium from a colleague, well actually the head of our department, who's retiring, and I'm going to look glorious, man. So this is the final look. I paired it with Velvet Muse from Lisa Eldridge because I wanted to have a nude that somewhat captures the undertones of the shade wit that I put in my crease and all over my lids, and I feel like Muse is kind of the perfect companion. I absolutely love how the pink paired with the green lower lash line pop. I think this may be my favorite out of the 3 looks that I created for this video, but honestly I've enjoyed every single look that I have done with the I Need a Nude palette. But I would love to know which one of the looks that you saw for this video was your personal favorite. So what are my final thoughts on the I Need a Nude palette? I think this is an okay palette. I don't think this is Natasha's best work, especially not this year. I think Yucca easily tops this palette in many aspects, in its originality, in the formulas that are present in there, and it's just like everything about the Yucca palette I think is superior to this, even though I personally don't even own the Yucca palette. One thing I want to mention in particular compared to a specific other brand that I'm very fond of is that I really applaud Natasha Denona for constantly reinventing herself with her eyeshadow palettes. She has released 3 eyeshadow palettes this year and not one of them is like the other. There was the Midi Retro, then you got the Yucca palette, and now we get the I Need a Nude, and they don't look anything alike. I applaud her for constantly doing something different, for putting together these color stories which remain interesting, which continue to excite us. Like everyone was losing their shit over the I Need a Nude palette. And is it a good palette? Yes, I think this is a good palette, but also you need to remember that this is a monochromatic palette, and just like with any other monochromatic palette, not everything is going to work out for everyone. For example, the Retro palette I never bought because it's the kind of like cranberry, mauvey, purpley toned eyeshadows that look like absolute trash on me, so I never bought it. So you need to look at this eyeshadow palette and think, first of all, is this an eyeshadow palette that I'm going to get a lot of use out of? And second, is this going to suit me? Because it being a monochromatic palette, it is not going to suit everyone. This is best suited for people who are on the cooler side of the spectrum, and also on the lighter side of the spectrum, because like I said, this palette suffers from the disadvantage that a lot of the matte eyeshadows in here reside in the same like tonality. There's not a lot of like difference in the tonality and in the depths of the tones, and I think that is going to be a problem if you have deeper skin, because you are left with very little to work with when it comes to the matte eyeshadows. I think the metallics are not going to be a problem. I think they're going to show up on pretty much every skin tone. I don't really have much complaints about the metallic eyeshadows in here. I enjoy the variety in the textures. I enjoy the variety in the textures far more than I did in the Glam palette. Personally, I'm really happy to have this palette, but I'm also happy to have it because I intend on making my perfect like glam nude palette by putting these two kind of together, because I think these two together are going to be perfection for nude glam types of looks. I was initially planning on sort of like taking eyeshadows from both and making the perfect palette, but then I realized that if I make a palette of rejects, I'm never going to reach for that palette. So I'm actually plotting on maybe putting all the mattes in one palette and all the shimmers in the other palette, and you know, at some point I will show you what I have done with these two palettes, but I don't think they're going to remain in the configurations in which they are as of current. So overall, there are things that I really enjoy about this palette, but this is not a palette without its flaws, and I feel like that's something that she's been doing lately with her monochromatic palettes. She keeps them very monotone, obviously because they're monochromatic. But let's go back to my personal favorite palette from Natasha Denona, and that is the Gold palette. This is theoretically also a monochromatic palette, but instead of only putting gold in here, she put obviously like different shades of gold, but she also gave us some neutrals. She gave us these really interesting like greeny duochromy shades, these teal shades here, and that made this theoretically monochromatic palette a little bit more versatile and a little bit more interesting. And ever since bronze, and don't get me wrong, I adore my bronze palette. It is such a reliable palette if I want to get a beautiful, warm, delicious, bronzy look. But it has nothing else to it. It would have been beautiful if she had put something like Purple Rain, for example, in that palette, or like a few different like pops of color. On that same note, I would have really loved to see like a pop of like maybe forest green, some neutrals with green sparkles to them, and now we're going to like my dream Pat McGrath palette territory, because this is like what I want Pat to give me. I want Pat to give me something similar to this, but with baked shades and interesting green sparkles, and possibly like a green baked eyeshadow. So I'm kind of projecting my hopes and dreams here on both Pat and Natasha. But I feel like if you take these two palettes and the concept of these two palettes, like both are monochromatic, but why does it have to be that like one tone? Give us a little bit more. Make it just a little bit more versatile than it could have been, because right now you're not going to get a great many variety of looks from this palette. You are always going to get a very reliable nude to cool toned eyeshadow look from this palette, but there isn't going to be a lot of versatility in here. If you wanted to have like a pop of something, you would have to pull out for a different palette. Whereas with the gold palette, you don't have to do that, because it's all in here. So I don't understand why she abolished the concept of this type of monochromatic palette in favor of her truly monochromatic palettes. Yeah. Before I start, you know, jumping circles and looping into my own thought process, I'm going to wrap up this video because it's already very long as it is. I hope this video was useful to you and you enjoyed all the comparisons and all of my thoughts on it. If you do own this palette, let me know what you thought about it, and if you don't own it, I'm curious whether my videos swayed you in one direction or the other. As usual, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you very, very soon. Bye!